A familiar face who's going to be joining us, and we're ever so grateful. Two very esteemed gentlemen will be having this conversation, the first of which you know quite well. His name is Bill Gates. He is the co-chair of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and driving this conversation with him is the moderator, Dr. Ernest J. Moniz, who's the president and CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative. We're very much looking forward to seeing what these gentlemen have to say. Thank you very much.
Bill, it's great to be back with you to have a chance to discuss and update our views in terms of climate change and innovation. I can't resist remembering our work together in 2015, leading up to Paris. I would say working on the two threads of mission innovation, the public and the private. I think that it was a great effort, and I believe real progress is being made, but that's part of our discussion to come. One thing I would say is relative to our work in 2015, clearly running up to Glasgow as opposed to Paris, the need for much greater ambition has become starkly clear. I think these 6 years have led to quite a change in the views. Clearly, the net zero objectives becoming much more prevalent. Maybe, Bill, you could just talk about how you see this change of ambition affecting, if you like, the agenda that you've been so actively pursuing.
Well, you're absolutely right that in 2015, the public's engagement, the number of articles about climate change were far less than they are today. And so even though the weather events are tragic, the fact that they are reminding people it's going to get a lot worse out there in the future if we don't take action, you could say that's a good thing. The other thing that came out of 2015 is that the need for innovation, I think, was made clear there. And, you know, of course, innovation starts with basic research funding, but then, you know, it's got to include funding for high-risk companies. And that's at that 2015 Mission Innovation event is where I made the commitment that Breakthrough Energy Ventures would orchestrate capital for the small companies. And I would say that's gone very well. In 2015, green investing was viewed as sort of a way to lose money. And even some of the venture firms that have been involved decided that the timeframes and the risk, the amount of capital meant that maybe it wasn't a fit for the typical venture model. Today, we find ourselves with that small company funding is quite strong. Not only Breakthrough Energy Ventures, but a wide variety of funds have decided to go in at healthy valuations, even fairly early stages. So the potential for a lot of innovation is, which we absolutely need, it's stronger today than I would have predicted in 2015. Now, will it come fast enough? Will we get the cost of these products down to the level that middle income countries like China, India, et cetera, will adopt them at scale in time? That's still a big question, but more awareness and more innovation than at the last climate conference.
But with this ambition of now net zero, do you see that in some sense qualitatively changing the kind of agenda, the kind of portfolio that we need? I think, you know, I could argue in Paris, we were still thinking in the 50 or maybe 80% emissions reduction, and going to zero and net negative beyond that strikes me as a bit of a game changer. Maybe you see it differently.
Well, we knew that until you got to zero, you know, the temperature would keep going up. And I think the climate movement got very focused on near-term reductions, you know, what could be done by 2020 and then 2030. And so what happens across all the areas of emissions, if you're going for a near-term goal, which I agree those should be part of the metric, But if you just have those alone, you'll have a tendency to take the easy part, which I'd say in the easy part would be passenger cars and say up to 80% of electricity generation, primarily using increased wind, onshore and offshore, and solar. That is where we can make the most progress in the shortest period of time. The hard areas, like how we make steel, cement, beef, how jets make long trips or cross-ocean shipping takes place, I think we were grossly underinvested in the research and new approaches in the hard areas. And the clarifying benefit of the zero goal is it really says to people, no, those other areas aren't optional. This is not a case where, we have we're just trying to get down 30%. And so go do the easy parts. And those two easy parts, 80% of electricity and passenger cars, they are about 30%, a little less than 30% of emissions. So I think it's sometimes bad news to people where they say, hey, I bought an electric car and, I see that solar's getting cheaper and cheaper. Aren't we done? And you and I have to say to them, no, that is a good start. But, for the world, the cost of all these other areas is going to have to be reduced quite dramatically to be able to say to the middle income countries, by 2050 at scale, adopt all these new approaches. And, so it's a more mature field today, understanding which offsets are real and, what the extra cost, what I call the green premium is. I'd say the sophistication of the field is far better, and the public interest in the field in almost every country is far better. Whether it's still up to the task, which in many ways we can say this is the hardest thing humanity's ever had to do, changing our physical economy with a deadline for doing it. There's experts in this space like Boslav Schmil who, remind us that, we're not yet at the pace we would need to be, and there is no historical precedent for what we're trying to get done here.
I think, Bill, I would add that the absence of historical precedent refers not only to the time frame, but also to the fact that I would argue that in the past, the transitions in the energy fuel mix really were more bringing in a new fuel on top of what you already had. And now we're talking about really displacing a major industry. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the IEA, up until very recently, would always forecast, how they saw the reductions. And, we went from, 80% dependence to like 76% dependence. And so there was this disconnect between the forecast of the practical minded from the aspirational goals of the climate movement. Recently, the IEA, to their credit, actually did a what if, where they said, okay, if we get to zero, what would have had to happen to utterly change their sort of business as usual forecast? And it was daunting, the number of innovations and price reductions. But yes, to take oil, which is cheap, and the less you use of it, the cheaper it's going to get. To take natural gas, which particularly in the United States and a few other places, is super cheap, and to literally deny ourselves, for making fertilizer, electricity, or just going to not use it or do some recapture type thing, that's mind-blowing. And what it means in terms of shifting the electricity generation sector that has to switch its generation and yet grow to replace the direct use of hydrocarbons and stay reliable and hopefully stay quite cheap. We're asking the electric generation sector to perform a gigantic miracle because they are where the new applications are going to turn to get their energy.
Mm-hmm. Going back to mission innovation, it was, in a very crude sense. I mean, I was obviously working on the public side, and you were working on the private side. What's your take in terms of how, on the private side, investors and companies are really responding to this challenge, and how do you see that path forward? I think you're working on some new initiatives here.
Right. So the pipeline, that starts with the research piece, where the U.S. in the Obama administration did make some very healthy increases. Sadly, that was flatlined. Now we're going to get it, I hope, pushed back up again. But the pairing piece of that has two parts: the sort of venture high-risk funding, which I'd give a very high grade to the world for stepping up there. Then the second piece is the project funding, where you have to do these scaled demonstration projects that the skills of the private sector, but the policy involvement of the government's very critical. We're just getting to the stage where some of the, say, green hydrogen technologies or sustainable aviation fuel technologies can be put into these big demo projects. So Europe with their recovery money, the US with some of the bills in Congress are talking about funding those things. And so a new effort that I'm involved in under that Breakthrough Energy umbrella called Catalyst will be about getting some private money and some philanthropic money to partner in those scaled projects. So I think it's very exciting that now we really have several paths that, say, might give us low-cost green hydrogen. Until you build the plants, though, you really, it's on paper, and only with volume do you get that, what we've seen with solar and lithium-ion, which is that great cost reduction. And so we're on the verge of that, and it's great that a lot of governments appear to be making that a priority. Enlisting the private sector in this, the level of activity there is night and day versus 2015. All the big companies feel like they need to participate in how they help with climate, whether it's their procurement, their political voice, their power to innovate. And so, building a consortium to do this catalyst to help make sure these projects go well, that's kind of the next priority. We have to hope that the financial markets stay strong, because the willingness to take risks, whether it's at that venture level or at the project level, the current economic environment where there's lots of investment money and there aren't many high return things, so climate is seen as a significant opportunity, that's very, very helpful. Even something like raising money for fusion, Commonwealth Fusion or the others, in this market, if you can pass some technical milestones, you can actually raise quite a bit of money. And so while the atmosphere is positive, we need to really take full advantage of that for all the stages that can help drive these costs down and really prove out, even in the tough areas.
It would seem to me that in going from that venture stage to that demonstration phase in the energy business, we're often talking in the billion or billions. But I think many would also argue that, of course, then comes the deployment phase where we have to talk trillion and kind of unleash a whole new scale of private capital. What are your thoughts in terms of how one can, given the risk-reward return equation that you alluded to, how do you see the ability to really open that spigot in terms of getting to the trillion?
Yeah, so eventually some of these technologies will get to the point where the green premium is actually zero. That is, let's take electric cars, because they're probably within a decade of that. What that means is that even without tax credits or special preferences for, say, parking or whatever for the electric vehicle owner, there'll come a point where if a government says you can't buy a internal combustion car, there won't be this huge cost and pushback, because the electric car, the price of it priced over its lifetime, won't cost more. And, you know, even the idea of, okay, can you recharge quickly? All those things, we will have taken care of that. So that's the point, that's nirvana, where you no longer need those special tax credits. The things that are getting close to that include onshore wind, solar, and electric cars. And so we need to keep the incentives there so we get that huge scale up to take place. And people with capital need to look at that and say, okay, you know, even though there's some risk here, society is asking us to look hard at these sustainable green type investments. So, you know, to drive solar installations 4 times faster than we are in the United States today, that's how much acceleration we need to get so that 80% of the new generation, which is about 2.5 times as big, is coming from solar and wind. So even those somewhat mature technologies you have to push. Now, hopefully the amount per unit you need of tax credits is small enough that you can drive gigantic volumes. Then you have technologies like offshore wind, which are not as mature. And so the tax credit per unit has to be pretty high, and the regulatory clearance has to be very clear. That one I can see also moving to become more economic. Then we have these things like steel and cement that we don't even know how to do it. And, you know, so that, you know, we're only going to have a small number of projects. The subsidy per unit to make that happen will be fairly high, but because you only need at that early stage, you know, like solar panels were used in space, or Japan and Germany, to their credit, were among the early providers of huge subsidies, tax credits to help that out. So we have to have a strategy, you know, for each of these stages. And yet I have to admit the total amount of government resource, you know, even deployed in a very clever way, is very large. And, you know, if you have some countries that aren't participating, you know, we'll have to use trade or other policies to try and draw them in. You know, otherwise they'll free ride all the hard work that the other countries are doing.
Mm-hmm. Bill, you've mentioned now a couple of times green premium. Maybe it would be worth your kind of explaining the construct, and then maybe drilling down into how you see some of the critical green premiums sitting today and what the trajectory will be going forward.
Yeah, I think looking at green premiums is a very helpful guide to how far we are from the solution. When I say green premium, I mean,
by the way, Bill, I'm going to give you a plug. See, here's the book you have to get to to understand this, right?
Yeah, so I go through it in depth in the book, but it's really pretty simple. It's if you buy a ton of cement, how much more do you have to pay to make sure that the activities for making that ton of cement had net zero emissions? Likewise, if you buy a ton of steel, how much more do you have to pay? In the case of cement, the green premium today is over 100%. And so it's pretty dramatic. Whereas for the passenger car, it's more on the order of 10 or 15%. And so much closer to getting to that magic zero. Innovators need to come in and show us different ways of making cement and of making steel. And fortunately, there are dozens of companies competing to do that. Those are two of the most difficult, and yet there's great entrepreneurs that are there. And I'm quite hopeful. You start with a 20% reduction, and then you try and get your way all the way up to 100%. If you can't get to 100%, then you need to burden in some direct air capture costs as part of that green premium to say, okay, you did, for the extra money, get absolutely to zero. To me, the green premiums will determine whether middle income countries in 2050, like India, when they build new buildings, to give basic shelter, will they choose to go with green cement or not? And unless that green premium is very low, or unless they're being subsidized, sadly, they'll say, hey, the rich countries did most of the emissions. You have to go and solve this thing. And, at today's premiums, there's no chance, it's over 5 trillion a year of subsidies that you would need. And so innovation needs to drive that number down by over 90%.
Mm-hmm. Continuing in the technology discussion, in the book, you make your list of breakthroughs that are needed. I would add a few things in the list, but that's always a question of personal view. But I think the main thing is that I would suggest that there's a grouping of your technologies which provides, I think, a logic in the pathway going forward. I like your take on it. Here's my taxonomy.
Right.
You have many entries which tell me that you are saying we are going to need significant firm electricity in the mix. Secondly, you have a set of entries, low to no carbon hydrogen, advanced biofuels, electrofuels, et cetera, which say clean electricity isn't enough, we need a fuel. A third grouping, you only have one entry, but I would have more, is that we need negative carbon technologies. And then the fourth grouping is we need to really change the agriculture and food supply system. That seemed to me to be the flow of your technologies. Comments,
yeah, so
elaborations?
Where in that taxonomy was the industrial piece?
It's spread out, but for example, I put it under a low carbon fuel. It's a fuel in quotation marks.
Okay.
Like low carbon cement, low carbon steel, et cetera.
No, exactly. I think your way of doing it helps people understand we need this unbelievably high capacity, high reliability electric grid. That is kind of the centerpiece, because
right.
Your car is going to switch to use that. Probably steel will switch to use that. A lot of things will be using electricity. And people underestimate how hard it is to stay reliable when a lot of your sources are weather-dependent sources. Now, the number of paths to solve that are very large. And so I agree, it's good to group it, because it's not just batteries. There's people who want to pressurize water, they want to pressurize air, they want to store heat. The number of ways to get energy storage, thank goodness, because right now they all look very expensive.
Hopefully long duration, yeah.
Exactly. No, short duration, the 24-hour cycle, that is likely to be solved. But the seasonal cycle and the periods where you get really bad weather, like a typhoon in Tokyo or a cold front across either the mid-US or heat waves, that's still very difficult. So yes, that grouping helps a lot. And I'm glad people are talking more about green hydrogen as a component of that solution, because that helps you with a lot of things if it's cheap enough. And so, thank goodness there's a lot of entrepreneurs and talking about that. A lot of governments that over the next 5 years we'll see the first generation of those green hydrogen projects. Sometimes those government-driven projects are done well, sometimes they're not. But that fits your taxonomy very well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can you say more about the strong driver for the focus on agriculture and food? Because I think, to be honest, I don't think that is well enough understood that when people get wealthier, we can't give them all animal protein.
Yeah, so the demand for meat goes up as countries get richer. A little bit less in Japan, probably a little bit less in India. But when we look at the crops we need to grow by the end of the century, it's partly population growth. That's about 30%. But it's those intense diets that today you actually have to grow quite a bit, say, to feed a cow to make a hamburger. I would have said a decade ago, I thought that was the toughest area of emissions. But there has been some progress by a couple of approaches. One, the synthetic meat from people like Impossible and Beyond, and the other is to use a cell culture approach that Memphis Meats and a bunch of others are trying. So, can they get their costs down? Can they get their quality up? At least we actually have some scaling up taking place, and we have some consumer acceptance taking place there. If you can really solve the animal protein, so meat plus milk, cheese, those things, and get those to be made not only with less emissions, but with less crops having to be grown, then you take the pressure off of the land. You can allow some of that land to reforest, and you don't have pressure to cut down more forest, which, as we see in the Amazon basin for growing soybeans or having cattle grazing, the pressure is still there, and the government hasn't been able to stop that from happening on a pretty large scale basis. So agriculture is still hard. We're in the early days, but I'd say the industrial with the steel and cement and all those things in agriculture, I consider those almost tied for difficulty now that we at least have some plausible innovations for that agriculture space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Bill, we're getting towards the end of our conversation. I'd like to kind of go back a step to firm electricity. You've been a pioneering investor in nuclear technologies. Maybe you could bring us up to date on how you see that evolving. And by the way, you can do both fission and fusion.
Exactly. So nuclear fission, in some ways, it's been a miracle. It's 20% of U.S. electricity, 70% of France. Sadly, it's got challenges in terms of the economics, and that's really what's slowed it down. Yes, safety is a deep concern that we need to do better on, but if you don't solve the economics, then you don't even get a chance to go after the waste and the safety and the proliferation, which are very important concerns. I funded a company called TerraPower that has a partnership now with the U.S. government to build a pilot plant, so-called fourth generation plant. And I'm hopeful that we can prove out the safety parameters and the economics of a next generation for nuclear fission. And, I think we need probably about 20% of our generation, unless there's an incredible storage miracle, we need about 20% that's not weather dependent. And at large scale, only nuclear fission or fusion are likely to get up there. Nuclear fusion is still in a technology development phase. You follow it even more closely than I do. The Commonwealth Fusion, of course, got their magnets working super well just recently. That was exciting. The laser ignition approach at the U.S. National Ignition Facility achieved a much higher energy output than they ever had before. So it's kind of impressive to me that there are a lot of different fusion efforts. Sadly, I don't think we can count on that because it's still in a science phase. It's worth funding, and I hope they surprise us. But I also think fission, in some ways, is more of an engineering problem. And so I'm glad that the U.S. government and some other governments are still pursuing that approach. We're going to have to really explain the safety to the public because the big mistakes, particularly Chernobyl, have created a problem. And you and I have had a dialogue about how do we get nuclear fission to be part of the solution for a lot of years, and I still believe in that. And the demo reactor will be a great milestone, although that it is going to take about 5 years before that gets done.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to summarize this entire discussion. Guarded optimism. And I think that that's something, Bill, that you've always projected, your commitment to technology and innovation and breakthroughs. And I hope we can continue to collaborate on this for many years. And thank you for your time today to really, I think, bring people up to date on this, on the core idea that innovation is at the core of climate solutions. And we got to pick up the pace, but we can do it. A fair summary?
It's exciting that people like Temasek are trying to figure out how they can get involved, and other investors. So a lot of partnerships needed here. Guarded optimism for an absolutely critical problem.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, great to talk to you.